Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Earlier today, Prime Minister Modi arrived in Britain for a visit that has received both enormous publicity but also a fair amount of public protest in the British papers. The visit happens at a time when not only is Mr. Modi politically on the back foot at home, but questions are also being raised about his handling of what many consider the rising tide of intolerance. On the other hand, Mr. Modi will be greeted with considerable fanfare in London and a very warm welcome from the British Prime Minister. Without doubt, this is an important visit for both countries. So tonight we assess Mr. Modi's visit to Britain and ask, what can we expect over the next 3 days? Joining me now is India's former Foreign Secretary and former Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Krishnan Srinivasan, Britain's former High Commissioner to India, Sir Richard Stagg, India's former High Commissioner to Britain, Shiv Mukherjee, the former head of the BBC in India and one of the biggest names in journalism, Sir Mark Tully, and the diplomatic editor of The Hindu, who joins us from London, Suhasini Heather. Krishnan Srinivasan, before we come to the substance of the visit, let's start with the timing and the issues that they quite obviously raise. The Prime Minister is visiting Britain after his crushing defeat in Bihar, and literally in the wake of some stinging criticism from L.K. Advani and M.M. Joshi, which has been picked up by the British papers. The Guardian, as a result, says his appeal to voters has begun to wane. The Financial Times says, and I'm quoting again, this is a turning point for the man who won the biggest Indian general election victory in a generation. Will the Bihar outcome cast a shadow over this visit?
Yes, I think undoubtedly it will. I think that if it had been a state of lesser importance than Bihar, if it had been a state with a smaller population and there had been a similar landslide defeat for the BJP, it wouldn't have mattered that much. But with Bihar and the stakes involved, I think it does matter. And I would say that the Prime Minister's personal reputation has taken a hit before this visit. So but of course there have been...
Sorry, carry on.
There have been some redeeming features, if you like. As you yourself mentioned, the British government is anxious to give him a very warm welcome. The Indian community there, by and large, is very supportive of Mr. Modi. And the FDI announcements of 15 areas of liberalization, I think, will go down well.
So, Richard, a second element of the timing of this visit is the fact that he's coming to Britain at a moment when there is a sharp degree of concern at home and no doubt internationally as well about what's called the rising tide of intolerance and his own relative silence. Now, today, some 200 writers have written an open letter in The Guardian asking Prime Minister Cameron to raise this issue. 40 British MPs, including the leader of your opposition and the Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, have signed a House of Commons early day motion calling for the same. Will the issue of intolerance in India be brought up by Prime Minister Cameron, or do you think Prime Minister Cameron will deftly avoid it, knowing that this is the sort of thing that could embarrass Mr. Modi?
I'm sure, Karen, that he will find a way to raise the issue, which is critically important. It's important not just for the issues of the humanitarian agenda, but for the long-term economic agenda, which Prime Minister Modi is so focused on. I think that Prime Minister Cameron will be looking for reassurance that some of the concerns expressed do not reflect Prime Minister Modi's actual personal intentions and views.
Give me an idea, as a former British High Commissioner to India, how Prime Minister Cameron will raise this issue without actually introducing a sour note into the visit. I mean, how will it be raised? He surely won't turn around and say, I don't like your intolerance and I don't like your silence. So what will he say?
No, I think that if I were to be the
say that he's been reading
I would suggest that he should say that he's been reading about concerns being expressed by Indians in India about these issues, about the way in which there is a perception that...
So in other words, Prime Minister Cameron will raise it by saying that there is concern in India, and I want to get your opinion. Now, you've been in reverse to Sir Richard, our High Commissioner in Britain. When this sort of issue is raised, what will Prime Minister Modi say? He can't turn around and say there's no concern in India, you're exaggerating, because he knows there is. And something like 5, 6, maybe now 700 authors, writers, scholars, historians have either returned their awards or written public letters of protest. So what will Mr. Modi say when this is raised?
I think I can safely predict what Mr. Modi will say if the question is raised by Prime Minister Cameron. It probably will be, but in a very oblique fashion, because Prime Minister Cameron's far higher priority will be to have a very successful visit with the Prime Minister of a country with whom Britain has very high stakes. What Prime Minister Modi will say is, to quote your words, that yes, there has been what is being seen as a rising tide of intolerance in India, but it has been met in our very democratic system with a rising tide, an equally rising tide of opposition. And this debate carries on in a very democratic country. It's been discussed in the media. We as a government do not subscribe to any such intolerance, but, and we will let the democratic process in India and civil society handle this as we always have.
Gentlemen, very quickly.
I'm not at all pessimistic about Prime Minister Modi's ability to handle this question, regardless of what are very legitimate media reports in the British press on what is
let me go back at that point too, Sir Richard, because this is an issue that interests Indians. It's topical and it's one that intrigues the viewers, because they want to know how do two prime ministers, who clearly both want a successful visit, handle an awkward issue. You've made it clear that it will be raised in terms of the concerns in India. You've heard your counterpart Shiv Mukherjee say that Mr. Modi will bat it off fairly discreetly. Will the matter end there? I.e., will it be raised, answered, and then will they move on?
I think that's the likely outcome, because David Cameron was very conscious that only 18 months ago Prime Minister Modi won a huge mandate from the people of India to govern their country, and that he will, I think, feel it would be inappropriate for him to get into the business of challenging a recently elected democratic leader on the basis of some evidence that the issue is not being handled as it was historically. But at this moment, it seems to me that he would not feel that there was such a weight of evidence as required to put this issue at centre stage, when there are many other issues which he will want to discuss with Prime Minister Modi of great mutual interest.
Now, Suhasini Heather, before I come to Sir Mark Tully, there are other protests that could be happening. We've seen pictures briefly on TV of Nepalese protesting against the Prime Minister's relationship and attitude to Kathmandu. We've seen some Sikhs protesting. We know that Awaz, a British-based organisation, plans to hold protests outside Wembley. How is all of that going down in London? Is it worrying the Indians, or is it the sort of thing that is to be expected? And does it not concern the Modi entourage? Oh, we seem to have lost the line there. Let me put that question to you, because you've been a journalist, you followed these sort of visits. How will those sort of protests, when they happen, and they are happening, and they're small ones, they're nothing big at all, but will they worry Mr. Modi and the entourage? Will they worry his British hosts?
I doubt very much whether they will worry Mr. Modi very much. I mean, we've seen the pictures on the television, and compare those protests with the enthusiasm of the welcome that he's giving, and compare that with the fact that he's going to fill the Wembley Stadium, and they pale into virtually insignificance, I would say. And also, of course, I think almost every leader who comes to Britain faces some criticism. I'm not saying, of course, that the criticism that these people are raising, or the issues that they're raising, are not important. They are. I mean, the Nepali issue is very important, but that doesn't mean it's going to impact on this visit.
Krishnan Srinivasan, this visit at the moment, and in the British papers, and perhaps for some in India as well, is likely to be compared to the visit that took place just a few weeks ago when the Chinese President Xi Jinping was in London. Now, the Chinese was a state visit, Mr. Modi's is clearly not. But both gentlemen will meet the Queen, although Mr. Modi will meet her for lunch, not for a banquet. But then Mr. Modi is spending a night at Chequers. Is it fair or is it unjustified for the media to try and compare the two? Because that's been happening both in the British press and it's likely to happen in the Indian press as well.
No, I think there's no comparison really at all. One is a state visit. That was the Chinese president who had a state visit with all the ceremonial that goes into that. Mr. Modi's visit is an official visit, and there's certain parameters for that. And I think that in terms of the country's economic ties with Britain, also they're not comparable. The Chinese have enormous economic connections with Britain, and that was proven during the visit also with some big bang announcements. I don't think we can expect anything like that of the Modi visit. I think the whole Modi visit actually has more traction in regard to the Indian media in India rather than in Britain. And also, just to add one more point, as Sir Mark Tully said, there were many protests about President Xi Jinping's visit as well, which took place a few weeks ago, and also President Nazarbayev's visit to Britain, which also took place just a very short time ago. So this is part and parcel of official visits to Britain.
Sahashni, can you give us, because you're there in London, you're covering the visit, a sense of the welcome that Prime Minister Modi's got and a sense of the reception that lies ahead, both when he goes to the Guildhall later this evening and then when he's lunching with the Queen? What is the nature of the protocol and the nature of the welcome that lies ahead?
You know, Karan, this is being seen as everything but an actual state visit, because you're seeing Prime Minister David Cameron practically accompanying Prime Minister Modi to most events. I mean, if you see him through the morning, they've been together at 10 Downing Street, of course, and then there is the Parliament session, or it's out of session, so there will be a statement made to it by Prime Minister Modi. After that, we've got more events where Prime Minister Cameron will himself be taking Mr. Modi, not to mention the overnight at Chequers. So it is being seen very much as everything short of a state visit here. I will add that amongst the other kinds of welcomes he's getting, and of course a lot of his supporters are out there, there's a Modi Express bus that is...
We are losing the line to Sahashni. That's one of the
London.
problems when you're connected to people on Skype, and particularly in Sahashni's case, because she's actually there on the streets covering the visit while she's talking to us. Let's move beyond the timing to some of the actual things the Prime Minister will be doing. Later today, he will be addressing both houses of Parliament. It's a special session that they've called for him to do so. I believe he's the first Indian Prime Minister to have that honour, though to be honest, I was surprised when I discovered that fact. How significant is that opportunity and that honour?
You're talking of the address to the joint houses of Parliament.
Precisely.
Well, it is extremely significant. You have an opportunity there to address every sector of opinion making in Britain. You have the opportunity to, through those MPs assembled there in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, to address the whole of Britain about the messages he wants to take there. I'm sure he'll speak, of course, of the historical relationship, naturally. But much more than that, I think Prime Minister Modi will talk about his vision for Indo-British relations in terms of what he wants to see in India, which is, I think, his stress will be on the development agenda, on the various initiatives he has taken on which he wants to engage the world community, especially including Britain, Make in India, and so on. So the stress on the economic and commercial ties and the potential that exists, which has not been attained. He will, I'm sure, talk about India and Britain's cooperation in the defense area, and I hope, and I think he will, mention the cooperation of both countries in the specific area of counter-terrorism.
Now, the interesting thing, and I'm going to focus first on Mr. Modi's intention to try and invite British investment, to try and push across his Make in India message, is that many British papers, and once again I'm quoting the Financial Times from just 2 days ago, say that there is actually a sense of drift in economic policy after an initial burst of energy. Furthermore, again I'm quoting the Financial Times, they say the Bihar defeat will make it harder for Mr. Modi to push his economic reform programs through Parliament. And clearly, many of his businessman interlocutors will have read the Financial Times and will be aware of the sense of drift if the Financial Times is to be accepted. Is that going to cast a shadow over his attempt to lure people to make in India? Or will the easing of FDI that we've seen in the last 3 days lessen that concern?
Well, I think that, first of all, obviously, Mr. Modi is aware of the problem, the atmosphere which is being created in some business circles about drift. And that's obviously clearly one of the reasons why he's announced the increase in investment allowances on various sectors of business. I think there is a sense of drift. I think one very important reason is that he has still not clarified the tax position satisfactorily. And I remember when Modi was being elected, just before that election, the one thing that foreign businessmen were talking about more than anything else was retrospective taxation. So I think that is one area he really needs to clarify.
So, Richard, I'm going to bring you in on that particular issue because the tax issues that Sir Mark is talking about actually apply, first of all, and maybe I should add worst of all, to British companies. The so-called retrospective tax issue came up directly with relevance to Vodafone, and then there's the handling of Ken and a whole lot of tax issues connected with that. And both companies are very unhappy, and I should add, not totally satisfied with the response they've got from the Modi government. In addition, British businessmen will be aware that critical reforms like GST and land acquisition are either stalled or deeply slowed down. In terms of labour, there is not much talk happening. How much of an issue will all of that be when Mr. Modi meets British businessmen?
I think that Sir Mark is right to say that the tax issue will be very important because it is seen symbolically as an example of an issue which the government has it within its powers to resolve, which is very significant for the companies concerned, and so far there's been the process of debate and promises rather than results. And I think until that is resolved, the shadow it will cast will deter people from investing with the freedom they might otherwise do. I think people here will distinguish that a lot from something like GST, where clearly the problem that the government faces is trying to get laws through an upper house where they don't have a majority. So there is a perfectly understandable problem, a political problem they need to find a way to resolve, and how they do that is not for us to determine, but I think people will be much more understanding about the problem over GST than they will over the problem over retrospective tax. And I think the one sector that there will be a lot of focus on here is on the financial sector, where there is clearly a great opportunity to develop financing opportunities which India needs to take forward the agenda of infrastructure, Make in India, the skills agenda, and that will require getting more capital into the country, capital which is available but not yet being deployed.
Krishnan Srinivasan, there are a lot of hopes, actual figures being bandied in the press that you could see some $15 billion worth of trade and investment go through. And the Business Standard says that perhaps one of the most major deals on the table is a new relationship with Britain's BAE Systems, A, to upgrade India's existing Hawks, B, to buy perhaps as many as 20 new ones, and C, and perhaps most importantly, to together make a new advanced version of the plane. From India's point of view, A, how important would that be, and B, will it fructify in this visit?
Would you mind if I just back up for one moment on the previous discussion? I'm not at all sure that this is a joint session of Parliament. My understanding is that Parliament is not in session, or the House of Commons is not in session, and it's not being held at Westminster Hall. It's being held in a committee room, and it's not only for members of Parliament. I'm sure your British participants on this panel can clarify this. Coming to the point that you mentioned, however, on the defence aspect, I think there are three basic issues which are going to be discussed. One is the Augusta Westland helicopter question, which has now been cleared in Italian courts, and I think that the British would like that to move forward. The second is the British are very anxious to sell India the Typhoon Eurofighter to augment the Rafale purchases. And on the Hawk BAE systems, as you perhaps know, there are huge orders. I think we've placed orders for 250 Hawks so far, partly manufactured in Bangalore, and I'm sure that there will be another order, maybe for 20, maybe for more Hawk trainers.
Very quickly, Suhasini Heather, I want to go back to you to clarify the beginning of what we heard from Krishnan Srinivasan, a former Foreign Secretary, that in fact Parliament has not been reconvened, that the meeting that Mr. Modi will be having with British MPs is not happening in Parliament, it's happening in a committee room, he said, if I heard him correctly. And thirdly, that is not limited to MPs, other people will be there. So are we in India mistaken in believing that this is an address to the joint session of and the joint houses of Parliament? Can you clarify that for us?
Hello?
Did you hear the question, Suhasini?
Karan, if you could repeat it, I'm actually in the middle of a lot of protests.
I will repeat it, yes. Krishnan Srinivasan, the former Foreign Secretary, said that in fact when Mr. Modi speaks to MPs, it will not A, be in Parliament, it will be in a committee room, B, it's not a joint session of both houses, and C, it's not limited to MPs, there will be other people there. So my question is, are we in India mistaken in our belief that he's actually addressing a joint session of Parliament, and this is the first time an Indian Prime Minister is doing so, that it will be, in other words, the equivalent of what Xi Jinping so obviously and publicly did a few weeks ago? Can you clarify that for me?
Well, absolutely, Karan, in the sense that Parliament is not in session at present. So it won't be an address.
Oh dear, it won't be. Sir Richard, are you there? Can you clarify that? We lost Suhasini at that critical point when she said it won't be an address. Can you clarify? We don't have Sir Richard either. Mark, do we have you, Sir Richard?
Can you hear me? I can hear you.
Can you clarify the answer? Is he addressing Parliament or not?
My understanding is he's addressing a meeting of members of the two houses who have been invited to attend, but I think that your other commentators are right to say that it isn't going to be a formal session of the two houses of Parliament.
So what you've said is that he's addressing a meeting which would comprise members of both houses of Parliament, but it's not a formal address to the two houses of Parliament. Have I understood you correctly?
That is my understanding. I mean, I've not been involved, obviously, in planning his programme, but that's my understanding. And it will give him an opportunity. I think the person who spoke earlier on saying it will give him an opportunity to explain to parliamentarians his plans, what he's done so far, and how he intends to take things forward is entirely right. I mean, it will be an opportunity to make some important points to a very important audience.
We're going to have to take a break at that critical point. When I come back, I'm going to pursue this particular issue because it's an important one. And I'll put it to Shiv Mukherjee. Is, in fact, the Indian media wrong or exaggerating in giving the impression that the Prime Minister has a signal honor and is the first Indian Prime Minister to address both houses of Parliament? Or is it just a meeting of some MPs, not even in Parliament, but in a committee room, as Krishnan Srinivasan and then separately Sir Richard Stagg, Britain's former High Commissioner to India, both seem to suggest? Welcome back, you're watching To The Point, and we're discussing Prime Minister Modi's visit to Britain, which began earlier today. Shiv Mukherjee, let's briefly pick up on that point that was made about whether the Prime Minister is actually addressing a joint session of the two houses of the British Parliament, or whether it's just an interaction or a meeting with some MPs from both houses, not even in Parliament, but in some room somewhere else, where others are invited as well. If it is the latter, and that's the impression given by Krishnan Srinivasan, Sir Richard Stagg and Suhasini Heather, then have we in India misled ourselves into believing that this is a signal honor never given before to any Prime Minister?
Well, it seems to be quite clear that it is not an address to a joint session of Parliament. I mean, that is a major event. It would then qualify for what you just said about the perception that it's a signal honor. If it is simply a parliamentary interaction with members of Parliament from both sides, it would still be a worthy inclusion in a visit to to the mother of all parliaments in Britain and so on, but certainly not at the level of an address to a joint session of Parliament, which would be a departure from protocol, which would be a major event.
And which is what happened for Xi Jinping.
That was a head of state visit, so the trappings of a head of state visit come in, so I wouldn't make too much of that, but certainly it is not addressed to a joint session.
Samak, undoubtedly, Pakistan, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Hafiz Saeed will be issues that will crop up. And recently, as you know, General Musharraf has confirmed that Pakistan trained LET and it had some role to play in assisting Osama bin Laden. What sort of response do you think Prime Minister Cameron will give Mr. Modi when these issues are brought up? Because this is an important area for Mr. Modi.
Well, yes, it is a very important area, and I think probably Sir Richard is better qualified than I am to answer this question.
But he may be more diplomatic than you, which is why I'm asking you. As a journalist, you would be more blunt.
But even journalists can be diplomatic sometimes.
Not today. It's not a tradition you've been known for.
I think, you know, there will be very much like what we've heard about when the reaction of the two leaders when it came to the question of the anti-Muslim atmosphere which seems to have been created. I think that what undoubtedly Britain has done fairly consistently is to try to do a balancing act between the two countries. And I think in his reply, Cameron will try to maintain that balanced position.
Which will not be music necessarily to Mr. Modi's ears.
No, but I don't expect, my own feeling is that Mr. Modi will not be expecting much more than that. But I think you should ask Dicky, really.
What I'm going to ask, Sir Richard, is not about the LET and Hafiz Saeed. What I'm going to ask you instead, Sir Richard, is that the British papers are speculating that Mr. Cameron will raise concerns about 2002, when, as you know, 3 British Muslims died in the riots. In fact, when Prime Minister Cameron's spokeswoman was actually asked this question by your paper, The Telegraph, her reply was, and I'm quoting, "Nothing is off the table." And certainly, if the issue of British citizens and the justice or injustice done to them is not raised by a British Prime Minister.
Okay, we'll go back to that story now and speak to Kamaljeet Sandhu. Kamaljeet, you know, the protest march, the protest by Sikh radicals has been a cause of concern for the Indian authorities. In fact, the PMO was even warned of, Sikh radicalism, by various groups. So what exactly is the Indian government planning to take up with their British counterpart?